Good. So I see that we are now live. Hey, everyone that joined live, everyone that going to watch it later. I'm excited to be here today. My name is Gabriel. I'm doing developer relations at Permit.io that you probably heard of if you're here because we inviting our friends usually. We are doing authorization. I am software development with long years in authorization. And today with me, Atul and Thomas. I'll let Atul introduce himself. I know him as the man with the cape. I'll repeat it for long,
Yeah.
but yeah, I said it.
So, yeah.
Good.
Anyway,
Yeah, Atul, so I'll
so
be happy to introduce yourself.
yeah. Thanks, Gabriel, for having me. My name is Atul Tulshibagwale. I am CTO of Signal, and the company I represent works in modern privileged identity management. So it's a way of achieving a zero standing permissions or zero standing privilege sort of model. And you can learn more at SGNL.ai. And before this, I used to be a software engineer at Google. And that's where I wrote a blog. At the time, I didn't think it was very important, but it seemed to have picked up. And now it's sort of there's a little bit of interest around CAEP, the continuous access evaluation protocol, as we used to call it at that time. And now we call it continuous access evaluation profile. So yeah, that's me.
Yeah, so good to have you here. I'm also happy that you have a background as a software engineer. That means I'll have common language with you. Thomas will have common language with you. So good to have you as a guest here. I'll get later to this, how you call it, zero, not trust. Do you have like
Zero
more
standing privileges.
zero standing privilege? I'll get to that soon because that makes me
Sure.
interested. But first, I'll let Thomas introduce himself too.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks, Gabriel. Thomas Kirk, solutions architect at Permit. Spent about a decade in authentication at Okta. Decided that was too easy and that I wanted to introduce pain into my life. So I joined the flip side of the coin and now work with authorization. Um, I think there's a lot more fun use cases and problems to solve now in the market with the authorization side, especially it's kind of like authentication was fueled early on with the move to cloud and hybrid, and now we're trying to figure out how this works in a zero trust model. Zero standing permissions is an interesting kind of newer way of thinking about how we do authorization. So I'm really excited to have a tool here to kind of get into the nitty gritty there.
Yeah, so good to have you with us, Thomas, too. I want to go back to the zero standing privilege because that makes me feel like as a developer, there is a security and there is shift left, and then there is things that provide like born left. And I feel like from what I know about zero trust, and I know some about zero trust. So zero standing privilege, is that the shift left of zero trust? We can say something like that.
That's an interesting sort of perspective because I have not heard that before. You can think of zero standing privileges as possibly something that is a part of the overall zero trust architecture, because in zero trust, sort of you basically want to verify on every access whether the requester of that access has permission to do what they want to do or not, right? Now, if you
Mhm.
tie that up with like static models like RBAC or even ABAC to some extent, right? You end up with a situation where that you're not actually considering the context of the access, most of the time, right? So you're let's say you're coming in to get to a customer record, but your role may offer that to you because you're a customer service person and you have access to customer records. But do you really need that access right now? What are you working on that makes you want to have that access, right? And that's kind of the
Mhm.
context that is considered in zero standing privilege. And that is super important because now what's happening is everyone's identities are at risk, and that has become a top vector in which hackers kind of attack companies. And the reason they do that is because once they have the assume the identity of an employee, they know that they have a lot of access, right? And that's because you have all these standing access permissions, in the organization. Now, with zero standing permissions, what you do is unless you have a specific reason why you're trying to access that, specific resource, you do not have access, right? And that's what we are able to achieve with what we do.
Got it. That's interesting because when I'm thinking about it, and I think it's kind of like shift left, because what we say is like we are extending the zero trust meaning of like we are trust every time at 0 point to a wider definition of like we are not only zero trust in verifying identity, we are also has zero trust in understanding permission or in privileged access. And that take me to the world of federated identity. I think that the zero trust starts shine with the hype of federated identity. What do you think made identity a federated identity? What is the state of going for that?
Well, I mean, that takes me back a really long time. So I was one of the early engineers at VeriSign, where we were building sort of the initial protocols that, now we all take for granted, like the TLS and the code signing and, OCSP and, all those things. And what we were trying to figure out is, okay, not everyone is going to have a certificate on their at that time it was a personal computer, right, on their endpoint. So how do you make sure that you can convey identity securely when the issuer is someone who's different from the relying party of that identity, right? Earlier, what we were trying was, okay, let's issue a certificate to the end user. Let's say you're employed with company. I don't want to say company X because that's actually a company. So company Y,
Yeah.
and
Acme.
if if you're employed with company Y and company Y issues you a certificate, you could then use that certificate at company Z and say, oh, I'm employed with company Y, and so therefore, you should let me in, right? So because your employer knows you, they've issued you the certificate, you can then use that certificate. Obviously, that didn't go anywhere because of the challenges we had with, certificate distribution with the UI and all that, right? And so a bunch of companies, like I remember at the time, it was Sun Microsystems. It was, they were one of the big players. They were Oracle. There were like a whole bunch of banks that, mostly based in the US, who came together. There was a lot of telcos as well, right, at that time. They all came together. We had our first meeting in Orlando where we formed the Liberty Alliance project, right? And there was this assertion format at that time called SAML 1.1, which created a little assertion, which was like, okay, this is how you encode stuff in XML and sign it and all that, right?
That's like 20 years ago, right?
Yeah, this was I think the first meeting was, I think 2000 or 2001. I don't remember, right? So 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Right? But yeah, so we got together and said, okay, we have this interesting SAML format, and now what we can do is, okay, I as an issuer, company Y, can generate a SAML assertion and send it to the user, and the user can present that assertion in a browser redirect, or something to the company Z. And so then the user doesn't actually need to have any certificates on their device, right? And so this created the first kind of federated identity protocol, right? And at that time, I know there was a lot of there was the browsers were not capable of sending these big blocks of XML, and so we had this artifact pickup and those kinds of things, and so it was more somewhat complicated. Well, that kind of all folded up into SAML 2.0, and I started my own company that was all focused around federated identity. So the initial use cases were basically that as an employer, you should be able to assert the identity of the employee, and then they should get access to your, let's say, 401k benefit or your healthcare benefits and stuff like that. So that was sort of how federated identity was born. What it really does for you is it clarifies the liability, right? my employer
Got
is
it.
asserting my identity, and that employer is telling the relying party that they can let me in as that person, right? What that means is that that employer is taking that liability of the user as an authentication, right? And
Yeah.
the benefits provider, who really has no idea who that user is, right? Because they don't have an ongoing relationship with that user.
Got it.
They absolve themselves of that liability because of federated identity. That is really what is important in federated identity. The user benefit is that, I don't have to remember passwords at every site. I get single sign-on and those kinds of things.
Got it. Yeah. So
Part of the problem, I can
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
real quick, Gabriel. Part of the problem, it seems like if you do the federation now, is like, does everything rely on the system to do authorization that came from the federated identity, or is it something that now you have to do with inside your application? So by decoupling those two and federating, how was it that those companies solved having to handle authorization, especially when you introduce that federated method?
Yeah, so authorization was actually, in the conversation right from day one, surprisingly, right? And has somehow not been addressed very effectively. But what happened was, even in the earliest, Liberty Alliance formats and, what became SAML 2.0, you have the authorization assertion that can be part of the part of the federated identity exchange. So at the time of authentication, you can also pull some attributes from the identity provider that can help you decide what that user is capable of, right? And so that has evolved into claims in OpenID Connect, scopes and OAuth. So there has been some basic level of, coarse-grained authorization that has been always there associated with federated identity. And at that time, it was okay because the time from when you log in and you end your browser session used to be a fairly short amount of time. It was something very specific you were doing with your browser. And so having that authorization information be conveyed at the time of authentication, which is what federated identity does, was all right. Having that as a coarse-grained authorization thing was also okay because people didn't really care that much about authorization. They was just very focused on solving the single sign-on problem. That's a great question because nobody thought of authorization at that time as much as we do now.
Well, fast forward now that we're there, because like zero trust and the like not trusting where your users are, and you're no longer in the building, that because even if you were in a building, you could have some level of federated identity. And how has this kind of pushed the boundaries of where these two kind of meet up, the authentication versus authorization, especially with how zero trust has enabled some of these components?
Right. And I think that's kind of, that's been the focus of my work for the last, 6 years at least, right? This is sort of starting with Google and maybe even before that. I was worried that, we are asserting the user properties, including the authentication of that user, at the time of login, right? And it used to be that people were sort of at their desk, in the office, and there was not much changing, between a login and when the session ended. Now you have, like you said, the mobile workforce and the work from home sort of picture. Your properties are going to change on a minute by minute basis, right? And now you have a problem that if you continue using that authorization that you had at the time of the login, you are now basing your decisions on old data, right? So, like you talked about zero trust, one of the principles of zero trust is to be able to verify that each access, is independent, right? And so if you're now basing that decision on an older piece of information, which is at the time of login, right? Your decision is not correct because it's not sort of correlated with what you're doing right now. And so that is why, we thought about this thing called CAEP, which was a way to propagate information between parties as and when those events happen, right? And so let's say you authenticated a user, you recognize that they're in their office, and you're allowing them to do certain things because they're in the office, and they can view personally identifiable information like let's say your social security number or something like that. Well, that user picks up their laptop and goes to a cafe, right? Now that environment is no longer suitable for disclosing PII, right? Personally identifiable information. And so what you have to now do is, okay, now the party that realized this, that, let's say I'm using a file sharing service or something like that, right? The party is going to realize that because of my IP address change, it's going to realize that, oh, this user is no longer capable of this information. It's going to generate an event, right? And it's going to send a CAEP event to uh, everyone that trusts it for that information and saying that, okay, this party has decided that this user is no longer capable of, accessing PII, right? And so then each party then can make sense of that event, generate its own events, and send them over, right? So basically, what we are doing with CAEP is essentially that we're able to modulate your access properties based on where you are, and you can now make decisions based on the most recent or most current information.
Yeah. I hear that many of like your use case examples are very workforce identity. So you mentioned like someone who is going with a laptop to a cafe, or someone who is trying to look. I'm trying to look on that on the perspective also of customer identity, because I think, like, from what I understand, CAEP, and I think I really want to hear more about a little simplified version of CAEP. But do you think the cadence of customer identity and workforce identity challenges are going together? Do you think we have more challenges in customer identity than we have in workforce? What is the status there?
Yeah, I think both are important. I think you're seeing devastating personal attacks using, user identity today. At the same time, you're also seeing like, really catastrophic attacks using workforce identity. So I think both are important. And we specifically have customers who are leveraging CAPE for, consumer type situations where they are, let's say you're running a bank and you have, numerous services in that bank, right? And a user is logged in to some service and they're doing some strange behavior. So one part of your bank now knows that this user behavior is not consistent with, how a user normally behaves. What that bank needs to do is it needs to inform all the other systems that, look, I don't think this is right, and I'm going to have this user re-authenticate. So I'm going to revoke their session, right? And so what that particular service can do is it can generate a session revoked event, right? And
Yeah.
it can say that, okay, I'm going to re-authenticate this user, so you do whatever you want with that information. Now, let's say there is a part of the bank which is, showing you the balance in your account or something like that, right? That may say, okay, this is good information. This service believes that they need to re-authenticate the user. I don't think the risk is as high right now for me. So I'm just going to let the user view their account and not do any changes. If they try to do some changes, then I will ask them to re-authenticate or something like that, right? So each kind of component can make their own policy decision based on that information. And so this is very, this is a real world use case that is happening, right? Where independent services that deal with the same user, even on the consumer side, can use CAPE to modulate their security properties.
Is it safe to say today that CAPE is more of a shared signal platform of communicating these risk events? And as a follow-up, is there, like, do you see a world in the future where they become more standard, where when I receive some sort of, maybe we can back up and do kind of like explain to me at a 5-year-old level what CAPE is, but do you see a day where CAPE sends the signals and then based on not necessarily code that you have to write and maintain, but rather some sort of standard that then handles all of those things for you? Is that kind of where CAPE is headed, or is it meant to be just this signaling platform?
So it's funny. I think you use all the words that we use, but you didn't refer to them exactly as the standards that they are, right? So you naturally came up with those words, but they are actually now parts of the standard. So you said CAEP, you said shared signals, and you said risk. And they're all sort of different parts of the standards thing that we're not now working on in the shared signals working group, right? So the history here is that CAEP came up as an independent thing outside of the OpenID Foundation. There's something already going on in the OpenID Foundation called RISC with a C, right? So it's called Risk Incident Sharing and Coordination, right? So the idea was that you should be able to share account properties with peers, right? So like if somebody's trying to hack the the Google account, they should inform the Microsoft or the Facebook guys that, oh, this account is under attack, and so if somebody tries to use that to do their recovery, you should maybe think about that, because we are seeing some malicious activity related to this particular account, right? And so it was sort of conveying account catastrophic account kind of compromise situations, right? So risk and CAEP kind of evolved independently. Risk was in the OpenID Foundation, CAEP was outside. We came together and we decided that, look, the mechanisms that we're using are the same, right? The asynchronous publish and subscribe communication and all that. And I'll get into that a little bit. Why don't we create a shared framework where you can communicate any kinds of events, and CAEP can be used to convey session properties, and risk can be used to convey account compromise or information, right, or account security information. And so that's how sort of the shared signals working group was born in the in the OpenID Foundation. And so what we did was we created, now CAEP and risk are both just a group set of events. The protocol, everything about how to set up the streams of communication, how to subscribe to specific events, how to subscribe to specific user or subjects, it's all in the shared signals framework. And so the underlying framework is common, and now you have CAEP and you have risk as sort of things on top of that. So coming back to your question, sorry, in this explanation, I actually forgot the question that you were asking. Sorry about that, but I think what you were
it's all right.
asking was,
I was with CAEP. I know that a lot of it, I mean, you have the shared signals foundation and the ability to pass this information around, but it's still up to the individual resource providers to handle their own sort of flow. Is that meant to be by design? Is there a time in the future where this moves to a more general or like handled approach out of the box instead of something where you have to custom code around it?
yeah. So there are two parts to this. One is sort of the policy part of it. Like, is there a common policy that everyone must follow, right, when they're using CAEP? Like when somebody sends a session revoke event, does that specifically mean do these things, right? So that kind of a policy uniformity is by design not in CAEP or in shared signals. The idea is that because we are talking about independent entities, right? You're talking about companies talking to each other, or independent parts of the same business talking to each other. One is typically not in a position to dictate policy to the other, right? So while you want the information to be communicated reliably, you don't want the communication to be more like a command that you have to do this, right? Because you want each party to make their own decision, essentially, right? And they may come to the same conclusion based on the level of trust, right? That take for example, something like let's say a Microsoft service, right, which is an OIDC provider to like hundreds of thousands of apps, maybe at least tens of thousands of apps. One of those apps says, oh, I'm revoking this user's session. You cannot imagine a situation where Microsoft is now going to say, okay, now I'm going to log this user out of everything, right? That's not going to happen, because you don't have that level of trust between those two parties, right? Whereas if it is between, let's say, Microsoft and Google or something, and Google says that this user account, session needs to be revoked, Microsoft may think about that differently and say, okay, we trust Google to send this information, and so we're going to take remediation action on our end as well, right? And so because there is this variation in trust between parties, I think you cannot really have uniformity in terms of what an event means as far as what actions you have to take, right? Now, the second part of your question, which is, can this actually be sort of taken for granted by developers and they don't actually have to write stuff themselves? I think that is possible, right? Because what you can have is a set of software, components that let you define your organizational policies, and those policies are propagated down to the code and to individual applications. And so when an application gets an event, the code inside of that application that interprets the policy already knows what to do, and they're able to take that decision without the developer actually having to worry about every event, having what to do with this event, kind of thing, right? So that you can imagine in the future that these things are already embedded in operating systems or in software like firewalls or gateways or whatnot, right? So an example of that is, for example, Apple has this thing called Apple Business Manager. So if you have an Apple School Manager as well. So if you have an Apple device that has been issued to you by your employer or your school, and let's say you're using an identity provider like Okta to authenticate yourself, right? Now, if Okta decides that this user session needs to be logged out, and there are specific situations under which they can do that, Apple can tell, Okta can tell Apple using CAEP that this user session has been revoked or this user has changed their password. In both cases, what Apple will do is force the user to, log into their device again, right, instantaneously. So what that means is that basically now you have, as a developer, you're just getting this for free. It's in the operating system, right? The user is going to be logged out, they're going to come back in, and you're cool, right? So this is a real world use case that is actually happening right now. So
That actually very interesting, because I think I'm trying to think and also see the question. I see a question in the Q&A that actually related to what I want to comment. So I read the question, and by the way, for the audience, if you have any kind of question, so you can do it in the Zoom Q&A, you can do it in the YouTube live comments, and you can do it in the LinkedIn comments. We'll answer them all from all the platforms. So if you want to ask, just ask. And it's amazing to see that someone has the thing that I actually want to comment. So Jeff asking here, with CAEP, would you combine it with something like OPA for decisioning, meaning the CAEP event is emitted via SSF and the receiver then use OPA to determine if the action is allowed or denied, or is it the policy included as part of CAEP or SSF process itself? I think you answered it, but I think you partially answered it, but I think this question has a perspective of someone who is trying to look at the CAEP from the practical perspective of, okay, I understand that I need CAEP, and I still want us to have this CAEP overview, but we'll get to that soon. We heard many interesting things. But what is your perspective around it, around the connection between CAEP and decisioning, CAEP and policy engines?
great question. So, and you're sort of thinking in the right direction, right? So if your application is already using OPA, right, then you can think of it in different ways, right? So you could be basically making, sending down a Rego file to the application, and then you're basing all your decisions in, upon the content of that particular file, right? In that case, you're not consulting newer data that has come through maybe a CAEP event, right? However, if you have some way of propagating that information to the application at the time it calls OPA, either by updating the Rego file with the appropriate, changes that have been reflected, using information from the CAEP event, or there's a way in which OPA can actually call out to make a decision, right? So you can actually call back to a central service and say, I need an updated decision. And you will have to do that for pretty much all the decisions that you have, because you cannot know ahead of time, like which ones are decisions that I can make locally and which ones I need new information for. So I think the trick here is basically to be able to propagate that session information to the application at the time it's making that call for evaluating access, right? And people have thought about distributed caches, like where you have an inbound CAEP session coming in, and then that session information gets propagated in a cache that is local to every application, so that the application can look up their local cache to get the latest information about, let's say, a new user that's coming in. Hey, is this user's session revoked or not? You just look it up in the cache. If there is no session revoked event, you know that user's session is still alive, and you let that user in. So you can still do all that using OPA. You just have to, the OPA, the agent, the policy agent has to basically, in addition to consulting Rego, maybe look up a cache or look up a central service, that kind of thing. And it's all supported in OPA, so you can actually plug it in right now.
Got it. That's good to hear. I hope it answers Jeff question. And again, more questions are welcome. I think it's a good point to get an explanation about the overview what is CAEP. I said that intentionally I aim to have you like the explain like in 5 challenge, but I think a good point here after all this very IAM discussion is a good point to challenge you with explain me like a developer. So you started to work on CAEP as a developer, a software engineer. So now I am application developer, IT developer. Explain me what is CAEP.
Yeah. So the problem as a developer that you have is that, hey, I'm having this user session with me, with my application that has been living forever, right? I don't know whether that session is still alive or not. How do I get that information, right? How do I know if that session is still alive, if the user has logged out or changed their password or something else has happened with that user? How do I get the latest information about that user in my application, right? And so instead of, before CAEP, there was a lot of discussion about this thing called continuous authentication, right? So periodically, the application would flip back to the identity provider, flip back because the identity provider has already logged in the user, and maybe the user doesn't see the password challenge. They just flip back to the application. And that's how you have sort of refreshed your session, right? And you know that the session is current. That is a terrible user experience because the amount of state you have in your browser now is, trying to rebuild that between redirects is just chaotic, right? And so CAEP is a way to address this problem that you don't need to keep polling for information about your application, about that user session, right? The information will be delivered to you, using, the asynchronous mechanism of publish and subscribe. So you can say basically, hey, I'm an application developer. I'm interested in knowing if any of my users have changed their password or changed their credential, right? I'm interested in knowing if any of my users' sessions are revoked, right? I'm interested in knowing if the device that the user is using for accessing my application has fallen out of compliance, things like that, right? And you subscribe to these events using now what is the shared signals framework with various transmitters. So, right, you might have a device management service that you're using, and the device management service will say, yeah, I can tell you when the user's device has fallen out of compliance or come back into compliance, right? Both ways. Same thing, an identity provider may say, yeah, I can tell you when the user has changed their credential, right? And anyone can pretty much tell you when they have revoked the session for a user, right? And so it doesn't have to be identity provider or application, anyone pretty much. And there are a few more events like that, right? So now in the latest draft, there are, I think, 7 different events, and I'll get into all those things. But as a developer, what this does for you is that you don't have to worry about whether the information that I'm getting is the most current or not, because it's assured to be current as long as you've been able to negotiate the creation of the stream, right? And what the shared signals framework does is that it allows you to negotiate the creation of these streams because you can say, hey, I'm interested in all these events, right? But the transmitter may say, well, for you, I can only share these events, right? So now that's the negotiation. And in the end, when the stream gets created, you know exactly which events you're going to get, right? And then you can also say, I need events for all users, or you can say, I need events for just these few users. And you can add those users to the stream and all that. So you basically have this substrate where you can be assured of getting the latest information about certain users, about certain events that happen to those users, right? And so that eases your life as a developer because you know that you're not making decisions based on outdated information. And you know that, if there is any change to the user properties, you'll know about it through the shared segments framework.
Got it. So I'm trying to think of it from my perspective again. I'll continue with my developer perspective. If I'm looking on a combination of like token-based authentication, and today I know many authentication provider that their JOTs live for 60 seconds. And token-based authentication plus fine-grained authorization based on, let's say, ABAC, like attribute-based access control, conditional access, or relationship-based access. How do this setup of token-based authentication plus fine-grained authorization setup is different from session-based authentication and CAEP?
Yeah. So yeah, short-lived tokens are a great way to secure access, right? The challenge is, how do you get a new token? Like, how does the user basically, because they're going to use your service for more than 60 seconds. So how are they supposed to get new tokens, right?
Yeah.
And you can either bounce that user, because of federated identity, you're not going to authenticate the user yourself, right? You're going to send them somewhere else to authenticate. You can't do that possibly every 60 seconds, right? Because your user experience will suffer a lot, right? And so what CAPE does, so that addresses sort of the authentication part, and I've just spoken about that for a bit, so I don't want to go into that again, right? Let's talk about the fine-grained authorization, right? I think that binding the sort of the authorization information into a short-lived token is an amazing way to secure the context of a specific operation, right? And it can insulate you from even like software supply chain kind of attacks, right? Because you're not trusting someone blindly. You're basically getting a token that's somehow tied to user activity, and that says, oh yeah, this user currently is calling this particular API with this intent and this details. Like they're buying 100 shares of Microsoft, so someone in between cannot just flip and say, oh, they're actually selling 1,000 shares of Google. They cannot do that, right? Because it's all sort of in a token that is digitally signed and all that. I wonder if you've seen this work that is going on, which is about transaction tokens. This is something that is happening in the OAuth working group of the IETF. This is a draft that George Fletcher of Capital One, Peter Castleman of Microsoft, and myself are working on. And it's exactly what you talked about. These are short-lived tokens that assure the identity and context of a specific operation, right? The challenge is, how do you tie that to sort of what the user is capable of doing at any given point of time, right? And there are two parts to it. So one is that you have an organization that have granted that user certain privileges, right? So it could come to you through a CAPE message, or it could come through you to through a SAML assertion or IDC token or whatever, right? Which are more long. And then there may be changes to that are communicated using CAPE, right? And at the time you're issuing that transaction token, which is possibly living for only 60 seconds or something, you can basically embed that information just for the purpose of that particular short-lived transaction. But I think this is a great way to secure access, because short-lived tokens combined with a good way to just be able to refresh them as soon as you need them is very important. And they can embed all the fine-grained information that you want, because it's very specific to that particular operation that you're doing. So yeah, look up transaction tokens in the OAuth working group of IETF. It's a great standard. It's still being developed, but it's very promising.
Got it. I wanna get back a little to the abstract meaning of continuous security or continuous identity security, because I think what we learned so far is that we have like an ecosystem of ways to do this zero standing privileged. You are using CAEP for, let's say, like something like, if I understand correctly, like event-driven mechanism. You're using short-lived tokens for a form of fine-grained identity information. You're using policy engines or like policy as data for fine-grained decision making. So you have like this set of mechanism to make sure from you have a very good understanding of like what is the at any point of time what is the small piece of authorization that I have now on the user. But from this continuous security, I have now a thought that we actually this three-factor of authentication, and authentication as we know that the problem that it tried to solve, the security problem that it tried to solve, is getting like to be a very, very specific and small point. So most of the continuous identity security problems that we have today are mostly part of what you can do, not who you are. Do you agree with such a statement?
Um, so authorization is definitely about what you can do, but a part of what you can do is you, right? Like knowing who you are
That's correct.
is part of that, right? And so just going back to this point about continuous identity security, right? People are used to, so there are two sort of big buckets in which you can put authorization information, right? So one is sort of admin time information, which is sort of when you're setting up your roles and groups and entitlements and whatnot. You're propagating that information at administrative time across your organization. Then the second part of that is your what you say login time information, right? So at the time of login, you may do some additional checks and you may place some, more restrictions on what you can do at the time login, right? So you can basically have a SSO token that embeds some, let's say the user is trying to log into AWS, you can embed some roles from the AWS sort of, IAM roles in that OIDC token, and you can basically say, oh, this user for this particular login can only do these things, right? So we are used to these two types of information being conveyed, right? And like you mentioned, there is now this third notion of event time processing, right? And which is what CAPE and shared signals represent, right? So which is something has changed, and now you need to sort of send that event across, and then you have to respond to that event. And this is what we are calling event time processing, right? And when it comes down to these sort of very short-lived tokens, like you mentioned, the 60-second kind of thing, that is the embodiment of all this information continuously, right? So for every operation that you're doing, you're making some checks at the time of the operation, and you're doing that continuously, right? So if let's say I have a UI and it's got like 100 components and there are 100 RPC calls that are being made, every one of those are going to be evaluated, independently, right? And I think we are actually in this situation now that we can achieve, continuous access, continuous identity security because of, on the one hand, we have the standards now more mature or emerging. Like we have, of course, we have single sign-on, we have SCIM for propagating information, we have CAPE and shared signals for event time processing, and now things like transaction tokens for sort of more continuous evaluation.
If I'm trying to imagine it to myself, so I'm thinking about like a monitor. Like you have a line, which is like a straight line, but in original or like naive thinking, you just have point in time, like 60 seconds or 1 hour or something like that, no matter if it's session or tokens. And K plus a good decision engine make it live, right? Like a real monitor. It's make the heartbeat. Make it, I mean, I think that's actually a very good approach to use. I mean, It's interesting because usually when you're thinking about continuity or continuous stuff, you're thinking only in one axis, right? Like the y-axis. So the timeline that you are going, but you say there is two factor for continuity, for English, for continuity. That's very interesting. And I think it's a good point to think about what the Gen AIs and AI agents and LLMs bring into that world. How do you feel they are evolved, break continuous security, help to that? What is your state on it?
Yeah. So Gen AI is both a great thing and it's also represents a new sort of set of attack vectors, right? Unfortunately, right? So let's talk a little bit about the potential for new attacks in Gen AI, right? So you're used to seeing these, funny looking texts or funny looking emails, which you can discern very easily that, hey, these are like, this is just bad English and there's no way, the
Mhm.
official organization that this email or text seems to be coming from could actually send this terrible sounding English text, right? You're not going to have that anymore because Gen AI can let people who are not familiar with English send beautifully written emails and text messages, right? So when there's one important hurdle, social hurdle that is now being crossed in terms of the attacks, right? What is more troubling, and this is happening sooner than you would think, is that you are now seeing multidimensional sort of phishing attacks, right? Where you're going to get a phone call from what seems like your boss. You're going to get an email which appears like that it's coming from your boss. And all this is going to correlate and make you think that, oh, maybe I should share my password or, maybe I should share my OTP with, whoever this person is, right? Because your social construct of I just spoke to that person. Like literally had that phone call in a couple of minutes back, and I spoke to my boss, and he requested it, and that's why I'm doing this. Or going further, now we are seeing some deep fake sort of things as well, where video, you're on a Zoom call. I believe I'm talking to you, Gabriel, but it turns out that it's a deep fake, and somebody else is actually doing the call. In the context of security, this becomes devastating, right? So it becomes like
Mhm.
really bad for authentication. Obviously, the right way to solve this problem is, first of all, obviously, other than the social aspect, which is like not trusting, or one good way to solve this problem is to have phishing resistant authentication, right? Which is use passkeys or use
Probably.
any other means of strong authentication that is phishing resistant. And I'm deliberately not saying multi-factor because strong authentication doesn't always mean multi-factor. Like if you're using passkeys, it's just a single factor, but it's strong, right? Um,
Mhm.
Now, coming to the bright side of generative AI, right? Because I think that there's a lot that can happen in the authorization space, in the policy management space, in the security space because of generative AI, right? If you've been to RSA recently, the RSA conference, you will have seen that there was so many companies that were promoting generative AI based solutions, right? Some of the interesting ones that I found was you could basically take um, latest news blogs, whatever reports about new vulnerabilities, and then generate patterns that you should look for in your logs so that you would know if you are vulnerable to those particular types of attacks. This was all done using generative AI. Fantastic technology, right? And it's not just one. I think there are a bunch of vendors who are doing this, right? So I think generative AI can definitely help you become smarter about detecting attacks, right? I think it's definitely uh, there. The other part of generative AI, which I find very interesting, is it's very hard for us to glean right now, what our de facto policies are, right? Because you may have codified some policies in your organization, they may have been translated into entitlements, groups, roles, whatnot, right? and you typically end up with a policy sprawl, right? You end up with so many different policies that you really don't know what are the effective policies, right? And in order for you to decide that, hey, this is this is my policy, and if I lock down these things, then I know that I've locked down my access, right? What you can do using generative AI is analyze your logs and generate those policies for you, right? And that way you can basically say that, oh, my de facto policies are this. And then there, if you see that, hey, why are these people getting access? Like, these policies don't make sense. You can then go back and see, okay, where do these accesses come from? Like, oh, there are these other groups that are causing these, excessive accesses. I can contain those, right? So there are things like that that you can do using generative AI, which were not possible without generative AI. So I think it's both a threat in terms of the attacks being more basically at this point, it would be safe to say that if you don't have phishing resistant strong authentication, you're not in a good situation because of generative AI. But it's also a boon because it is, it can let you be smarter about your policies, your unpatched vulnerabilities, and all those things.
It's the age-old
Yeah.
dance of security, staying ahead of the bad guys and playing that game back and forth. So it seems like one way to combat it, you're saying, is to stay ahead of it with AI. So cool to hear that insight. For me, I see, I mean, you just to transition, I know we have a few more minutes left. You have your hands in a lot of different working groups and have, for years been a part of helping define these specs and protocols and ways of doing this, which is when I think back, it's like, who is writing all these things? Who's coming up with these ideas? Who's getting involved? How do you get involved? There's some level of dream that I think people who are working on these things, I mean, the authentication authorization community is small. What is a good way to get started? How do you get plugged into these things? What would you recommend for those who kind of had that as a dream?
Yeah, great question. And, it's just sort of these ideas are there with a lot of people, right? Like, there's nothing, unique about what I've come up with or something, right? If there are probably 15 other people who have thought about the same thing, we just were able to get together and agree that this is how we will sort of do this together, and agree on sort of the formats and the mechanisms and all that. So that's what makes it a standard, right? But as a developer, or as someone who's in the identity or authorization community, what you can do is, first of all, sort of build awareness, like, what is important, which are the standards that make the most amount of sense, have a sort of an overall picture of, okay, this is what I can use. Like, I can use FIDO for authentication. I can use, OpenID Connect, or, SAML for, authentication to, federated identity. I can use, I don't know, Auth0 or, something else for authorization. I can use CAEP to convey the signals. Just build that awareness of, like, what are all the things out there. And I see a microcosm of it. There's probably a million other things that I don't know about. The second thing is, of course, sort of start using it, right? That where can I sort of rely on the standard? What makes sense for me to rely on the standard, and what makes sense for me to innovate for myself on, right? And so sometimes you may say, I'm not going to have some proprietary way of doing single sign-on, right? I'm just going to use a standard, right? But hey, the innovation I can do is maybe providing the right user experience, maybe, making it simpler for developers to use some of these things, right? So those are all the innovations that you can do. So the second part is sort of just being able to internalize the standards and start using them where it makes sense, right? And then sort of the contribution part is the third angle of it, which is, I feel like it should be driven more by the need. Like, this really shouldn't be something that I'm innovating on, right? Should be something that it should just be common across everything. That realization that, this is a burning problem and everybody needs to solve this, that's what can make a successful standard. And even if it is that all that, it's going to take years before, like, we started working on Liberty Alliance and SAML like back in 2000, and it's sort of now you're seeing after 15 years it was sort of everywhere and all that, right? So it takes a really long time for standards to get adopted and get built. CAEP is just 5 years old, right? And transaction tokens are just coming up right now. So it's like you're going to spend a lot of time trying to make these things happen. But there is definitely a lot of benefit to it as well, which is you once you have these standards in place, you have solved a very important security issue for the whole community, right? So that's definitely there. So because if you go to IETF and if you go to RFCs, there are thousands and thousands of RFCs out there, right? Does everybody use every RFC, or does every standard that comes up get used? Probably not, right? So a good place to start is for you to decide that this problem is very important to me. I really feel like this problem needs to be solved, and I feel like there's no point in me trying to innovate here for myself, right? This is something that everyone needs to agree on, and that like this is how we're going to solve this problem, and let's just make that a standard, because you're basically giving up your intellectual property when you're defining a standard, right? You're giving it up to a standards body. So yeah, that's how you would do that.
Yeah, I think this point is actually interesting because we have 2 minutes. So I'll just mention it. I have a very special conclusion that I get in my mind in this session. But for the first, I think there's a very special thing to put. If you have a standard, it doesn't mean that you need to implement it all or to use it all. And that's great for every standard. You need to take what help you with that and not what break your thing. We see that a lot. Me and Thomas has many times the discussion about scheme, right? Because I don't know anyone who implemented scheme at all. I don't know anyone who used scheme at all. But the way that you have something in your back mind that drive your way right it's an important thing, right? And I can say the same about Google Zanzibar. I can say the same about any kind of identity. And identity world is full with standards, right? I think is a good way to put things. I want to share one very good conclusion that I have. I think we do not have a question. If you have, that's the last minute, put it on. I think that I have a very important conclusion. So for years, for myself, like session-based authentication was a bad thing, where token-based authentication was the good thing to do, right? Because token-based let you decentralize, let you federate, let you everything is secure. But now after this discussion, I'm thinking for myself, maybe session aren't that bad, right? Maybe we need to think about sessions, but also about the way that tokens work. Maybe we need to take also something good from session, which is the continuous effect of it. Because in tokens, we have some continuity, but we are trusting someone else. Maybe the good thing to think about authentication, authorization at all is not token-based or session-based, is a continuous-based authorization that can combine the both of the good of tokens and sessions. So thanks for that insight. I'll take it with me. I think we're just on time. I see that we don't have Q&A, so if you have anything to say for before we are leaving, that's the time.
Well, I mean, this has been a great talk. So, thank you so much for making time for me. Happy to talk, continue the conversation via LinkedIn on Q&A or whatever. So
Absolutely.
just great to be here.
Great, thank you. I'll mention again that Permit, we are trying to do a live stream around the connection between IEM and developers every week. So if you want to subscribe notification, you can do that in our Luma page, lu.ma/permit.io. And yeah, see you in the next live stream. Thomas, do you want to say your last words?
Thanks for joining, Atul. It was great hearing this insight, and I look forward to continuing conversations.
Yeah, and as I
Thanks.
said,
Thanks,
you'll
Atul.
get soon a link to YouTube, so you can send it to your friend. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you. Bye.
Awesome.